Central America?
Yep.
Oh, good.
Beautiful thing about Google Earth.
Yeah, right about there. This is a little bit of a smorgasbord of a meeting, as you can tell. We got different issues that we're raising, but they're all connected. And that's kind of the point that we're trying to make, is that those of us who live in the United States, that's 5% of the world's population. 95% there's other places. And probably 95% of those problems originate here. The United States is by far the most powerful country in the world, influences everything that goes on in the world, and is responsible for a lot of the problems in the world. Anybody disagrees with that, see me afterwards, we'll have a cup of coffee, but I can prove it. But just as an example of how things are connected, this is Central America. By the way, Mexico is in North America. If you didn't know that, that's an interesting fact. So we got Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama. In the 80s, when there used to be an anti-war movement, there were U.S. wars, or threats of U.S. wars, all through Central America. And they were threatening to invade El Salvador. And there was a tremendous march on the Pentagon on May 3rd, 1981. 100,000 people, U.S. hands off El Salvador. And Alexander Haig, who was the chief of staff under Richard Nixon, wrote a book. And in it he said that the decision on whether to invade El Salvador came within the 6 months of the Reagan administration. That would have been June, by June of that year. So I think that demonstration had an effect. They had to take it into consideration. It wasn't the only reason. But the anti-war movement had an effect. But those wars, just take El Salvador. The U.S. was in there directing the counterinsurgency campaign against the Farabundo Martí Liberation Front, the FMLN. And they were sponsoring death squads that were going around assassinating community organizers and labor leaders, as well as the guerrilla, leaders and people who were sympathetic to them in the villages and so on. And this was all under the guise of anti-communism. Communist was a 17-year-old peasant, whose parents were killed by the military and was organizing against the government. And Nicaragua, the same way, the Sandinistas overthrew the dictator. It was an actual revolution, and then Reagan sponsored Contras, they called it, counter-revolutionaries, who attacked Nicaragua. And when Congress didn't want to pay for the Contras to do this, Reagan got the money through an arms deal with Iran. That was the Iran-Contra scandal. Guatemala, the U.S. was supporting General Rios, who was an absolute vicious dictator who carried out genocide against the Mayan people, the indigenous people, and were just going to wipe out whole villages. Very similar to what the Nazis did in World War II in Eastern Europe, where I think relatives of mine were murdered, whole villages, and one of them I think was a village where my people lived, on my father's side. And as a result of this, there were tremendous problems throughout Central America, and right-wing organizations that evolved into drug gangs and turmoil and violence and poverty that today it is continued to such an extent that people leave their own homeland and come north. And the Honduras, a country that had an election in which a popular president was very much expected to win, and then the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton, the liberal who we wanted to win the last election, interfered in the election and made sure that the right-wing puppet of the U.S. won. And there was tremendous protest and repression, and then it happened again in the next election, And it's one of the reasons why Honduras has so many problems. So the U.S. wars in this region directly contributed to the immigration that we see today, and also NAFTA and many other, situations. Trump says that the gang M13 is pouring across the border. M13 started in Los Angeles. By Salvadorans who, according to one theory that seems to have a lot of basis, grew out of the right-wing death squads in El Salvador, came to this country, started MS-13, and is one of the most vicious, really terroristic drug gangs in the country. A direct result of the U.S. intervention in El Salvador. So today we hear about Venezuela, but a similar situation is developing in Nicaragua. Sandinistas were elected back into office, and things were going well, and Nicaragua was one of the most stable and safest countries in all of Latin America. And people were coming to learn about their police tactics because they had real community policing in Nicaragua and real relationships with the police and the communities. And the crime rate was extremely low. Now Nicaragua is in turmoil. Why? Because outside forces have fomented a counter-revolutionary movement within that country, similar to what is going on today in Nicaragua, similar to what has happened in other countries around the world, including Ukraine, that I'm going to touch on. So this is just to illustrate why we raise these issues, because they're all connected. We can't just talk about a war overseas without talking about how it affects us here at home. People, 1/3 of all the veterans that have fought in the U.S. veterans that fought in Afghanistan, in El Salvador, I'm sorry, 1/4 of all the veterans that have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan come home with PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and get recruited into police forces. Yeah. The Pentagon program that gives police departments military equipment for free, so that some little town, with 12,000 people has a SWAT team with an anti-personnel carrier. When you see a little incident here in Richmond, watch to see the photos. Two young people took shots at each other on the West End last year, missed. Nobody got hurt, and they showed 2 armed personnel carriers and 20 or so cops dressed exactly like military soldiers, with flak vests and helmets and automatic weapons and so on, in a cul-de-sac in Western Henrico County. The militarization of the country, not to mention the fact that half our federal dollars go to the military. They tell you it's 25%, but that's not really true. They don't count nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons do not come under the Department of Defense, they come under the Department of Energy. The Veterans Administration, which has something like 200,000 employees, is not part of the military. It's part of the Department of Veterans Affairs. See? And don't forget, all the health care which veterans deserve because they were used for unjust wars, but that's very expensive. And that's ongoing, a lifelong commitment, that is has a claim on the budget. And then when you talk about the national debt, most of that is from paying for wars with credit cards. So that we are paying for past wars now. And the interest on the national debt is somewhere around $500 billion a year, while the 25% they tell you is the military budget is about $600 billion a year. So put it together, you've got, plus the nuclear weapons and the VA, and you've got more than half your federal tax dollars going to war, but we don't talk about it. How come there's no money for schools? How come there's no money for jobs programs? How come there's no money for infrastructure? How come there's no money for universal health care? And to heck with Medicare for all. I am really down on Medicare for all. Because I was in London last year and had a heart problem and wound up in the hospital and found out what universal health service in Great Britain means, and it means it's free. There's no co-pays, there's no deductibles, there's nothing. You're sick, they take care of you. And here they say, well, that would bankrupt us. But it doesn't bankrupt them, see? Because they don't fight as many wars as we do. So these things are all connected. So we could talk about just the effect in the abstract of these wars. But there's three instances that we want to talk about, and we also want to leave plenty of time for group discussion, you know, questions and answers and so on. We want to talk about NATO, which nobody talks about. We talk about war, but nobody talks about NATO. And we want to talk about Ukraine, which is another subject. What's that got to do with anything? And Venezuela, which at least people understand is now a current event, because tomorrow there may be an actual physical confrontation on the border between Colombia and Venezuela. Europe. We'll go to Europe.
You want to go to Europe now?
Yeah, I want to go to Europe. I had the opportunity, because we work with a national coalition called the United National Anti-War Coalition, and they've had some conferences in Europe that nobody else was free to go to at the time. So I got to go, and it was a real eye-opener. I never thought much about Europe. We're always talking about Latin America and Asia and Vietnam and Africa and so on. But I was kind of surprised, really, to learn just how much struggle was actually going on in Europe. But the reason why I'm going to mention NATO is because NATO was formed on April 4th, 1949. So this April 4th will be the 70th anniversary of NATO. And to celebrate, the foreign ministers of all 29 NATO countries will be in Washington, D.C. And so the UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, felt that we shouldn't let this date go by without a protest because of what NATO has done. And we'll touch on that. So there's going to be a national march on March 30th, the Saturday before April 4th. And then there's going to be days of activities leading up to April 4th. And UNAC is handling the march, and the defenders are working with folks in D.C. on the logistics of that. We're also on the program committee. We're also handling security. And so one of the sneaky reasons to have the meeting is we're hoping to find some folks who might be willing to work with us, at least on the day of the protest, Saturday, March 3rd. We could really use some help. You're used to him?
Yes, I've reserved a 15-passenger van to go up to D.C., so we can talk about the logistics of that later if you want to go.
Okay.
And we got a call and asked if we had someone who could coordinate transportation from Richmond. So, okay, we're moving right along. So, but why protest NATO? Nobody knows what NATO is. Well, that's why you protest, because it's an educational effort, you see? You want people to know what it is. So let me just spend just a few minutes. We can't exhaust these subjects tonight, but we want to just give you enough information to say, well, I didn't know that. If you could say, I didn't know that, and that's interesting, and I wish I knew that, then the meeting is a success. We got the first base. Okay. So, yeah, here's Europe. During World War II, Hitler and the Nazis and their expansionist policy and their genocide was an actual real threat. It was different than a lot of the wars the U.S. fought. The U.S. fought two decent wars. One was the Civil War, which didn't start out to end slavery, but it wound up that way because it actually was about slavery, even though the North didn't want to say so in the beginning. And Abraham Lincoln once told Sojourner Truth, if I could have saved the Union by any other means than war, than ending slavery, I would have done so. Imagine that. He told that to Sojourner Truth. A great liberator. Thank you, Abraham Lincoln. So, and then World War II, which the U.S. had its own purposes and was thinking beyond the war and what it could scoff up around the world. But Nazism had to be stopped. Fascism had to be stopped. So that was another good war. But during that war, the U.S. was allied with, U.S. and Great Britain were allied with the Soviet Union. First they were kind of hoping Hitler was going to go east and the fascists and the communists could duke it out and then they could pick up the pieces. But there was a non-aggression pact, which is a controversial thing between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. But then Hitler went back on it, attacked the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union really broke the back of the German war machine. They lost 20
20 million
20 million people, most of them civilians. And that was, and that took the steam out of German expansion. And one of the things I learned was, my folks are from up here, Vilna, my grandparents. And it was Lithuania, it was Poland, it was Russia. My grandfather used to say you had to look out the window and see what flag was flying in the morning to know what country you're in. But I think it's part of Lithuania now, actually. And that was a heavily Jewish area. And Hitler's plan for Poland was to depopulate it. And Anna and I were in Poland 2 years ago, and we traveled down to visit the Auschwitz concentration camp museum. And there's a quote by Hitler, and he said, and the best way to do this, to depopulate Poland, is starvation. Because the children are the most vulnerable to that. So this guy had to be stopped. So after the war, the Western powers go, well, okay, we were in alliance with the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin was even, man of the year on the front page of Time magazine. But we got to switch gears now. Because when you have a country that's socialist, put aside the question of democracy, put aside the question of empowerment of the working class, put aside every good or bad thing you ever heard about socialism. What it definitely means is you can't make money there. The natural resources and the industries and the businesses and the companies are nationalized. And the profits are used to meet the needs of the people, and there are no private profits. It is taken out of the capitalist sphere. And that is why they don't like socialism. If it was because they said, well, that's a brutal dictatorship, well, then they'd go after Saudi Arabia. They would have gone after South Africa during apartheid. There's any number of brutal dictatorships in the world, but if they're capitalists, they're okay. Unless they have oil, and that's a problem. So the Western powers said, we need to form a military alliance to make sure that the Soviet Union doesn't spread communism. Like when I was a kid, we in Catholic school, we had the Catholic Messenger came. It was every month. It was a nice, full color magazine, and there was a picture of China, I remember, and the communists had poured red paint over the map of China, and it had become Red China. But then on the next page, it had the priests and the nuns, and they were mopping up the red paint, and they were clearing communism. That's how communism isn't a result of people wanting to rise up against a brutal dictatorship, take control of their economy, and use it for everyone's benefit. That's not what it is. It's red paint. So anyway, they wanted to form an anti-communist alliance, and it was a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and formed on April 4th, 1949, 4 months after I was born. I'm older than NATO. It was going to be an alliance against the Soviet Union. It had 12 countries, all from Western Europe, plus the US and Canada. 4 years later, the Soviet Union formed an opposing pact called the Warsaw Pact. And it had, I think it had 9 members. And they actually never went to war. There never was a shooting war between the West and the Soviet Union. They had the Cold War, and proxy wars and so on. But they never actually went to war. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and that would make a great topic for discussion sometime, what happened? Secretary James Baker, Secretary of State James Baker, under Reagan, told President Gorbachev, President of the Soviet Union, and then later President of Russia, and then later Mayor of Greater Moscow, and then President of the Tenants Union of his condo. He kind of shrunk as the empire went down. They told him, don't worry about NATO. NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. We will not recruit any of the former Soviet republics or the countries that were in the Soviet sphere of influence. That was 1991. Warsaw Pact dissolved. Today, from 12 countries in NATO, there are 29. And all the new ones are in Eastern Europe, former republics of the Soviet Union, or socialist countries. And most of the ones in the East now have very right-wing governments. They came to power based on what? Anti-immigration sentiment. And what immigrants are they talking about? The refugees from the US NATO wars in the Middle East and North Africa. That's who is coming into Europe, and that what has fueled xenophobia and anti-immigrant feelings and right-wing powers. You now have real right-wing governments in power in Poland, in Hungary, in Austria, and of course in Ukraine. And you have powerful anti-immigrant movements now in Britain, in France, in Germany. And when I say right-wing, I don't mean, young Americans for freedom or something. It's a lot more like the organizations we saw in Charlottesville. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that NATO has been moving steadily towards Russia. So that now they have, can we move this up a smidge to show more of Eastern Europe? I know I can't go on too much longer, but move up this way. If we can. No. Up. Right, that's good. Okay. Ukraine is not part of NATO, but it may as well be, because the United States goes to Ukraine and trains the Ukrainian military. Canada trains the Ukrainian military. The UK, United Kingdom, trains the Ukrainian military. And they have exercises here, up to the border of Russia. They have naval exercises. Every year they have a land exercise, every year they have a naval exercise, the US and NATO countries and Ukraine, in the Black Sea. There's Ukraine, there's Russia. Now, if Russia had naval exercises, joint naval exercises with Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico, twice, every year, and land exercises in northern Mexico, like, say, in Tijuana, well, how would we react? How would we feel? But that's exactly what's happening there. Oh, yeah, but Russia's very powerful. Well, it has 7,000 nuclear weapons. The U.S. and the Western powers together have about 7,300. So it's rough parity. The Russian military budget is 7% that of the United States. And 11%, no, I'm sorry, I always get that back. It's 11% that of the United States and 9% that of NATO. And if one country in NATO is attacked by any other country, all the other countries have to respond. It's a rule of NATO. So there's no symmetry there. And the NATO bases, and they're in Georgia, they're in Latvia, they're in Lithuania. Belarus is still not connected with NATO and has friendly relations with Russia. And last year there was a military exercise here, right on the border of Poland and Belarus. And the Associated Press reported that the Russians and the Belarus also had a military exercise over here in Belarus, right up to the frontier with NATO. That's what it said. They were conducting a military exercise right up to the frontier of NATO. Can you imagine that? How aggressive. And people say, oh boy, that's really bad. What the hell is NATO doing here? What is U.S. troops doing there? What are U.S. troops doing in the Black Sea? Ships. They just sent another one over there last week. You can look up a NATO website. They are wonderful about telling you what they do. They are so proud. So our view is that NATO is a threat to Russia. And what Russia is trying to do is defend itself against NATO. NATO does one thing, Russia does another thing. NATO does one thing, Russia does another thing. Russia also has a military pact now, but it's with 7 or 8 very small countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. There's no comparison between the two. Hello, Charles.
Bill, I just want to let you know it's 7:30
Okay, so I gotta move along.
Yep.
Okay. So, and when the U.S. goes to war in the Middle East, they can do it with NATO. When they go to war in North Africa, when they decide that Muammar Gaddafi is a threat to his own people in Libya, so they bomb it to smithereens. So there is no government there now to speak of. And ISIS comes in and takes the military weapons that belong to the government and brings them down into northern Africa so that they're in Mali, that they're in Cameroon, that they're in, they're in Burkina Faso now. You know, and spreading extremist terrorism in these countries as a direct result of the U.S. and NATO destroying what was the country with the highest per capita living standard in the continent of Africa. Because at one time, Gaddafi was talking about uniting all Africans against the West. That is the history of NATO. So it would be embarrassing for NATO to come to the United States, celebrate 70 years of war and warmongering and sucking up the resources that ought to go to human needs in the countries, and not do something about it. So we're going to have a nice rally, we're going to have a march, we're going to have a very interesting march that goes past the offices of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Organization of American States, the Border and Customs Enforcement Office, the Mayor's Office, and I think there's one more, and draw the connections between the two. We're going to video it and turn it into an educational documentary that can be used to show people, you know, the connections between. And also, a lot of people don't know all this stuff is right there, right around the White House.
We talked about the Ukrainian civil war and the right-wing violence in Ukraine.
Let me do 5 minutes on Ukraine, 5 minutes on Venezuela, and then stop, and we can have a discussion, okay? It's not really fair to do those two quickly, but I had to push NATO because we're responsible for this march and rally, at least the logistics of it. And there hasn't been an anti-war demonstration in this country of 1,500 people in about 10 years. Imagine that? There was one of 2,000 here in Richmond in 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq. But there hasn't been anything here of that size since. So we want to try to at least, we're trying to hit 1,500. And it would be wonderful if, if folks come, just attend it. If all you can do is go up for the day and attend it, it'll be very interesting, very educational. And the weather is going to be absolutely perfect. I know this. So it'll be a nice spring day, and you'll enjoy it, and you'll learn a lot. And we'll be able to hold our heads up that we did something. Now, Ukraine. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And it was called the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Very rich agricultural soil, really unusually rich. Sort of like, the U.S. Midwest. And then down here in the eastern area, they called the Donbass, that was an industrial area, coal mining and manufacturing and so on. When the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, Ukraine became an independent country for the first time in its history, except for about 3 weeks right after World War I. Ukraine was always considered part of Russia, going way, 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 way back. But a different country, but Slavic, and the whole area goes back to the old Kiev Rus Empire that predated, the Russian Empire, and so on. Very fraternal relations, close relations, and so on. But they went their separate ways. In 2003, there was a right-wing movement that developed. When I say right-wing, the issues of the countries that were formerly socialist, and then became independent countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union. What distinguished them, what's going to happen with the state-owned natural resources and infrastructure and companies. We're going to sell them. They're now privatized. That's what it means to go from socialism to capitalism. To go from capitalism to socialism, you take over the mines, the factories, the farms, and you operate them for people's needs and not for profit. When you go the other way around, you sell them off. Well, who's got the money to buy a steel company? Somebody who has some money already. Who had the money? corrupt officials, corrupt government officials. And there was a lot of corruption in these countries. So they go out, they buy up the resources at bargain basement prices, and all of a sudden they're very wealthy. And they have a lot of competition. So to keep the competition off balance, they recruit security. But in these areas, this security are paramilitary organizations that look back in history to the Ukrainian forces that fought on the side of the Nazis against the Soviet Union. When I was in Odessa, where's Odessa? Down here. Odessa. All right. I went there for the second anniversary of a massacre by fascists attacking people who were opposed to the coup of 2014. And the fascist organizations had applied for a permit, same time, same place as the memorial, to have an educational class for youth on the use of machine guns and pyrotechnics. Get it? So they're asking Americans and other people to go over there and stand with them, the relatives of those who were massacred, on the theory that maybe if we were there, the government would hold them back because they didn't want Americans to get killed, because then we get a lot of attention, and, you know, like white people, you know, like Snick asked white people to come to Mississippi in '64, would you come down and work with us? Because if you get killed, then they'll get in the news. So we did that. But in 2014, there was another right-wing movement to kick out the president, and the president was a bum. He was corrupt. He was like, they're all corrupt. Every one of them was corrupt in Ukraine. It's like, that's a corrupt country. You know, the old thing, you look up the dictionary and the corrupt, it has a picture of Ukraine. But he wanted trade relations with Russia, where the parliament wanted trade relations with the East. So there were protests against his corruption, but they morphed into anti-Russian protests. And organizations came and got involved that weren't part of the original protests, and were dressed in paramilitary organizations and had submachine guns, and all dressed the same. They had insignias that were based on the old Nazi symbols. You know, the double lightning rod going down. I saw these in Odessa. And they kicked out the president, they brought a new guy in, he was voted out, and the present one, his name is Petro Poroshenko. And he just declared himself a banderista. Banderista. Stefan Bandera was a Ukrainian nationalist who formed a paramilitary organization responsible for killing some 8,000 Jews and Polish prisoners of war and Soviet prisoners of war, and fought on the side of the Nazis until the Nazis worried that what he really wanted was an independent Ukraine, so they put him in jail for the rest of the war. But he lives on today as a hero. He has been rehabilitated as a hero. They have streets named after him. His birthday just became a national holiday last year. And if you see the pictures, and you can find all kinds of them on the internet, videos of the nationalist marches, they have 2 minutes for Ukraine or 2 minutes for the whole thing.
If we're going to talk,
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got
We
5
could,
minutes.
okay, we could push it a little past 8 because the custodian will be here till 9, but we have to end in time to clean up everything. But you're right, I need to wrap it up. So, after this right-wing coup, 4 months later, on May 2nd, 2014, there was a confrontation in the city of Odessa, and this big mob of, led by fascists, they weren't all fascists, a lot of them were right-wing soccer fans, who over there, the soccer has a different connotation than football fans. They're political. They're very militaristic, they're very physical, they fight, they have big fights between team fans and so on. But they also tend to be very nationalist, which means right-wing over there in that context. So they chased a couple of hundred people who were opposed to the coup and were petitioning for the right to elect their own provincial governor. Like we elect our governor, they don't elect their governor in Ukraine. It's appointed by the federal government. They wanted, that's what the demand was, to elect their own governor, and maybe have somebody who was a little less oppressive than that would be appointed from Kiev. They chased him into a 5-story building called the House of Trade Unions and set it on fire. And people were overcome by smoke and flames. They jumped from third, fourth floors of the building. When they landed, they were beaten to death with clubs. Google Odessa, May 2, 2014, and you will see all kinds of cell phone videos. There's documentaries too, but just look at the cell phone videos from onlookers, and you can see what happened. It was an absolute massacre. At least 42 people were murdered. No one has been charged with any crime for those murders. But there are people who were inside the building who are still in prison today without being charged of anything, but they were known to have been inside the building. So one of the things that the defenders do is we coordinate the Odessa Solidarity Campaign, which supports the relatives in Odessa of those who were murdered, who are calling for an international investigation. So on May 2nd this year, there will be a protest in D.C. that we're organizing at the Ukrainian mission. It's the third year in a row we've done it. So we'll also be asking for people who are willing to come up about that. And this year we're going to write a book about all of this, because nobody knows what goes on in Ukraine. And, you know, that's not even getting into the question of Crimea and Donbass and the other conflicts. We could talk about that another time. Anna's going to kick me off in just a few minutes. So I'm just going to go to Venezuela.
You said May 2, 2014.
Yeah, and it's a good segue, because what the U.S. did to support and promote, and in many ways lead, the protest movement in Ukraine that led to the overthrow of the government is being repeated today in Venezuela. Now this is good to know. It's good to see the map, because here's Venezuela, you see, it's backed by the sea. Colombia, which now has a very right-wing president, and Brazil, which has an even more right-wing president. I mean, he's pretty much an out-and-out fascist. And that means that Venezuela is you know, surrounded by these two countries and the ocean, and is physically isolated, you know, from other more progressive countries in the region. I want to read one little thing. Oh, gee, I wish I had so much more time, but I know I don't. But I'm going to read you something about, it's very short, it's very short. It's about recent history of Venezuela, Venezuela. And it's from the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA puts out something called the CIA World Fact Book. And it's every country in the world gives a rundown on size and geography and demographics and you know, literacy rates and infant mortality and forms of government and everything, you know, and it's like a resource for politicians, the serious ones, and also for journalists. It's online, anybody can read it. But one of the things about it is, it's accurate. This isn't meant for us. You know, this is like how Charlie Pellegrini up in New York used to get mad at me for reading the New York Times instead of the Daily News. He said, you know, it's got no funnies, no sports, no jumble. So why do you read that? I says, because that's what the rich people read. So they put the other stuff in the paper so you read that. But that's another story. So anyway, it talks about, you know, how Venezuela was one of 3 countries that emerged from the collapse of Gran Colombia in 1830 and became an independent country. Under Hugo Chavez, president from 1999 to 2013, and his hand-picked successor, President Nicolas Maduro, the executive branch has exercised increasingly authoritarian control over other branches of government. And it goes into a little bit about Maduro. But I thought this was most interesting. Social investment in Venezuela, social investment, during the Chavez administration reduced poverty from nearly 50% in 1999 to about 27% in 2011. Nearly 50% from 99 to 2011. Increased school enrollment, substantially decreased infant and child mortality, and improved access to potable water and sanitation through social investment. Missions, quote unquote, dedicated to education, nutrition, healthcare, and sanitation were funded through petroleum revenues, which the government owns. The sustainability of this progress remains questionable, however, as the continuation of these social programs depends on the prosperity of Venezuela's oil industry. Well, have you bought gasoline lately? Have you seen it that low before? It actually was 99 cents when I first moved here in 2000, but under $2 a gallon. Well, what's interesting is that the U.S. convinced Saudi Arabia to cut back to increase production, which lowered the price of world oil, but it hurt Saudi Arabia to do that. So why did they do that? Because the U.S. asked them to. Because who else does it hurt even more? Venezuela and Iran. Because they're both so heavily dependent. Venezuela gets half its government revenue from oil. And that was the money that was providing all these social programs. So the U.S. manipulates the oil market, the price of oil drops, it slaps sanctions on Venezuela, because it's a socialist country, which means you can't get their oil. And they manipulate currency, and they have a long-term plan of recruiting young Venezuelans into civic organizations, and they train them in things like social media and civic engagement. And Juan Guaido, the guy who complained that Maduro was an illegitimate president because they said that his election was fraudulent. So Guaido skips the whole question of elections and crowns himself president. And the first country to recognize him is the United States. Because, why? Does it have anything to do with the fact that Venezuela has the world's largest reserve of oil in the entire world? And it belongs to the government, and they use it for the people. Is there corruption? Sure. Is Maduro Chavez? No. Did he make a lot of mistakes? I haven't looked into that closely, but I'm perfectly willing to believe he did. But what in the world gives the United States the right to go in and interfere in that country's internal politics, slap sanctions on it, decide who the president is, send aid and said this aid's coming through your military whether you like it or not? That's an invasion. What right does the United States have to do that? None. The defender's position is the United States has no right to interfere in any country, anywhere in the world, in any way. Not war, not threat of war, not sanctions, boycotts, conspiracies, assassinations, internal subversion, supporting, quote, democratic movements in other countries, nothing. Stay the hell out. You have blood on your hands from 1607. You have no right to interfere in anybody else's country. The second thing is, which is just as important, if not more so, is we support the right of every oppressed people to determine their own destiny, the right to self-determination. And both of those principles are being violated by the U.S. going into Venezuela. So, we could talk a whole lot more about that. I am going to stop now, because I got to go home with Anna tonight. I don't want any problems. But why don't, Anna, why don't you take over again? And while we have a discussion, it doesn't have to all just be questions and answers, but let's have a discussion where people think about all of this, and more importantly, what we should do. Because that's what we really want to come out of this.
I have one question. Didn't that Donald Trump a few years ago said that they was pulling out from NATO?
Yes, and he also said he's pulling out from Syria.
Yeah.
We're not pulling out of Syria, we're not pulling out of NATO.
Okay. Well, I meant to say the coalition.
Right, yeah, he brought it up, but he's not doing it.
He's not doing it?
No, it's another one of his, he gets attention, other people sitting down and say, Donald, because, no. Stormy Daniels, okay. NATO, no, that's it. You don't talk like that.
So one of the questions I get is, how do the people on the ground in Venezuela, like, who are they signing with? Because I haven't seen a lot of polling, like, are they signing with the president of the General Assembly down there, or are the majority of people siding with Maduro?
Majority of Maduro.
So the people are siding with, because I know the military is with Maduro, so most of the people on the ground, they're looking at this as what it is, which is a coup as well, right?
The Reuters news agency, Reuters, which is, big bourgeois European agency. It's like, New York Times. They had an article 2 days ago that said they estimated 20% of the population was still very enthusiastic about Maduro, and that was the poor.
20%?
The poorest of the poor. But in addition to that, you do have the military, you do have the students, you do have government workers, and that's what they say come out for the rallies. We hear about the rallies against them, but they don't tell us about the rallies for them. And they're both. Both are. The country is divided, and it's primarily divided along the issue of class. The protests against Chavez and then against Maduro always began in the wealthy neighborhoods and came downtown. You can read that in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. It's only recently that some of the poor have gotten involved because the conditions are becoming so bad.
So I got here late, but what's the defendant's position on the aid as far as being at the border? Because as far as him, Maduro, I'm talking about denying entry, because I believe the rationale is that they're looking at this as potential soft first steps to an invasion, and which I think is...
The International Red Cross and the United Nations have both refused to cooperate with this humanitarian aid effort because they say it's politicized, and aid should not be politicized. Now, is there a humanitarian crisis? There's shortages, there's hunger. I don't think Maduro should deny that. But why is that happening? The price of oil, the sanctions, the manipulation of the currency, and hoarding. Because there are plenty of reports of people who go to the poor parts of town, there's nothing on the shelves, and then they go to the rich part of towns, and the supermarkets are full. But if we could make a suggestion to Maduro, it would be, tell him thanks for the humanitarian aid. We need it because of you. Because you've created these problems. So give us the humanitarian aid and we'll distribute it. But that's not what the U.S. says. They want the military to step aside, disobey the central government, split the military, and let the opposition take the aid and distribute it. And meanwhile, Maduro is saying, we just bought $300 million worth of aid from Russia and China. We'll distribute that. You can keep your $200 million. Because it's not meant to be aid. It's meant to provoke a crisis on the border.
And my understanding is there's already an offensive being planned too. They already have aid at the border, I believe, of Colombia, if I'm not mistaken, by Caracas, and they pretty much just a standoff that's being planned. I think there's some concerts happening as well.
Richard Brandon from the Virgin Airlines and associated companies is organizing a big concert on the Colombian side of the border to raise money for this humanitarian aid. And Maduro is organizing 2 concerts on the other side, and Pink Floyd. Who was that? Was the guy? Not the whole band, but one of the Pink Floyd guys just came out and blasted Branson for taking part in a phony concert effort, because it's not humanitarian aid. It's meant to provoke a political crisis. If you want to give aid, give it to the country, give it to the Catholic Church. But don't give it to the guy who crowned himself president. That's crazy.
You know which town, where along the border?
There's 3
Colombia,
places.
where they're doing
This is Cucuta, I'm not sure.
I know.
Cucuta.
Okay.
Which has a history as a smuggler's town. I don't know if that particularly matters, but so does
Right
Odessa
there.
for that matter. But yeah, people go back and forth a lot through that area, and, selling goods that were subsidized in Venezuela for, market prices over here. There's also a section, there was supposed to be an opening with Brazil, and then there's also a section along the coast. And the Venezuelan government has closed all 3 of those.
So, near Caracas?
Is it Cura?
No, that's an island, that's
Curaçao.
Curaçao.
Curacao is its own thing.
Yeah.
Caracas is here.
No, it's not Caracas, it's the capital. But anyway, there were 3 places, one on the coast, one in Brazil, and one in Colombia, that the aid was supposed to, be stockpiled and coming through. I want to make the point that we can argue all day about the Maduro government. And there's a lot of people who I know and trust, have been to Venezuela, who say, he's not Chavez. Chavez was immensely popular among the poor and the working class, and hated by the wealthy. And I meant to read the other section of the CIA that talked about during Chavez's administration, middle class people left about 1 million. You know, they say now there's 3 million. But during that period, about 1 million people left. They were the middle class. But poor people from other countries were moving into Venezuela for the health of free health care and free education. It's in the CIA World Fact Book, okay? So the question is not how you feel about Maduro. The question is, that's a country that has a government, and does the United States have the right to go in and change it? And does it have anything to do with the fact that John Bolton, National Security Advisor, about a week ago says the U.S. economy will benefit tremendously if U.S. oil companies take control of the oil in Venezuela? I mean, thank you for your arrogance, because it clarifies everything. If you're worried about humanitarian disaster, go to Yemen. As a matter of fact, I had this idea that we should ask Venezuela if they would send some humanitarian aid to the East End in Richmond. Because we have hungry people here in this city, and the United States government won't take care of them. We have homeless people. We have people who have to choose between buying food and buying their medications. We have old people who are in desperate situation. This is bullshit. You create a humanitarian crisis and then you solve it on the condition that the military defies the commander-in-chief? No, this is not. This is not a legitimate situation. And our responsibility is not to straighten out Venezuela's problems, whatever they are. It's to say, U.S., hands off Venezuela. Self-determination from the Venezuelan people. That's the only correct stand to take.